We're going to take a run through comparative religion as we look at witches, and then also we're going to look at cults. So let's begin kind of understanding what comparative religion means in the humanities first. So in the humanities, we study religions and we make comparisons between them. I think a lot of times what we find are similarities, and we often group religions, like the Abrahamic religions. So the Abrahamic religions include Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And then in my Humanities 1 class, we look at the big five religions that also include Hinduism and Buddhism. So, also, I think with religion, we're really looking at how religion creates values, the types of myths that come in religion, the type of architecture and art. And I would say that's one of the most exciting things in the way that I study it is really looking at the diversity and the fervent, beautiful art that has been made in the service of religion. There's an awful lot of great art in that regard. And then, of course, too, when you're talking about Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, you're talking about ethical monotheism, where all three religions are worshiping the same version of a God, the God that is created by the Jewish religion is the same God that Christians use and also has the same characteristics that is the God in Islam. Whereas in Hinduism, we are looking at polytheism, and then in Buddhism, we are also looking at a type of religion that has not necessarily a ethical God, but ethical behavior is kind of the ultimate goal. Buddhism is interesting in terms of it really is about psychology as much as anything else. I think we also look at the role of magic in the world. How does magic and transcendence fit when we study religions? And to me, it all begins with shamanism, a religious practice that might go back to the very beginning of human history, where medicine and history and music and transcendence are all tied together in these religious ceremonies that often also involved imbibing the spirit of an animal too. So we're going to take our religion studies and we're going to look at how witchcraft and Wiccan is a recognized religion in America. And then also, I think we want to look at how witchcraft kind of has some of the qualities of shamanism in terms of healing the sick and communicating with spirits and escorting souls of the dead in the afterlife. So, again, we're really starting when we study religion in the humanities. We're really starting with probably shamanism, then we get to some of the older religions like Hinduism, and then we spend quite a bit of time on Judaism and Christianity and Islam because they have such an impact in the Western landscape. So much of the Western landscape definitely falls into some sort of Christianity, whether it's reformative, evangelical, or the Catholics. Islam, of course, I think is very interesting because it is the latest of the three Abrahamic religions. And I think it's really fascinating with Muhammad as a prophet that God speaks to him directly and from God's words and entire religion forms. And I also really like kind of mulling over the idea of, is there any difference in importance to the first time God speaks or the last time God speaks, right? Like, is there any in any way like some perceived hierarchy of authority in terms of the chronology of that? So again, we're going to move away from the big five, and we're going to take a look at witchcraft. So, in our study of witches, and again, our study of witches in media, of course, we'll start with a kind of broad early history and what the origin of witches are. So, early witches are people who practice witchcraft using magic spells. And the way that spells work is also very fascinating to me because it usually involves some sort of use of herbs or alchemical language. It's putting together. I think the idea that language is involved in spell making is pretty fascinating because it means that certain words, when put into a certain order, have the properties of unlocking, if not the divine, at least the magical. So many witches were thought to be pagans doing the devil's work. That is going to change when we get to studying the Wizard of Oz. That is the first time in a media where we get a witch who is a good witch, and that not a witch that is in some way doing harm. So when it comes to witches, very often witches are thought of as women. Warlocks are kind of the male version of women, but I'm not sure exactly what the divide is. But I can say that it seems to me that very often women who were older or single or possibly lesbian or maybe had different political thoughts than their community. It seems if we study things like the Salem witch trials, they were often put in kind of these villainous roles or at least blamed for bad luck. Many, though, of these witches are healers who are engaged in herbal medicine, and I think herbal medicine no different than the kind of Chinese medicine that begins to appear 3,000 years ago. And I think that they also have a kind of wisdom to them in terms of the profession. Now, we don't know exactly when witches began, but there are some early records of witches. One of them is in Book 1 of Samuel in the Bible, thought to be written between 900 and 700 BC. And it tells the story when King Saul sought the witch of Endor to summon the dead prophet Samuel's spirit to help him to defeat the Philistine army. The witch roused Samuel, who then prophesied the death of Saul and his sons. And the next day, according to the Bible, Saul's sons died in battle and Saul committed suicide. Other Old Testament verses condemn witches, such as Exodus 22:18, which says, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live." And additional biblical passages caution against divination, chanting, or using witches to contact the dead. So I think what this means to me is that clearly there is a understanding in the ancient world that there are older religions, or at least different religions, that apparently, if people aren't afraid of, they at least recognize there might be some power in terms of what they're doing. And a lot of times I think in kind of chiropractic medicine, in acupuncture, I use both of those methods for medicine. And to be honest with you, I don't understand exactly how it works, but I know that it does work. And so I know that there is something that isn't just simply modern medicine and science that has been at work in this world. And I don't know if it connects to some spirit world or anything like that. But I do recognize that there is something to this simply beyond just stories and myths. Folk medicine, I think also. I think a lot of women who maybe were pronounced witches were maybe people who were practicing folk medicine and using herbal remedies for ailments, keeping gardens with herbs with medicinal properties. And we see this in the Romans. We see this also in the Middle Ages, too, in monasteries. I think the most famous of the folk medicine practitioners in Europe in the Middle Ages is Hildegard of Bingen. She is a nun in a monastery. She had visions of angels, visions that were actually made into a book. She is a early practitioner and writer of Catholic Church music. And she also writes a book on medicine. So she's kind of doing a lot of stuff, a really important figure in the Middle Ages. Her understanding of the plant-based medicines informs her commentary on terms of how the humors work in the body. And the humors are things like black bile, blood, these different fluids within the body that it was believed in the Renaissance and the Middle Ages that illness was caused by an unbalance of these. And things like leeching and bloodletting and stuff like that were used as ways to cure. And I think that idea of the body being in balance is also something we see in yin yang, again in Chinese medicine as well. So we're looking in her book as a view of the symbiosis of the body and nature, and understanding that nature could inform medical treatment of the body. However, Hildegard, maintained the belief that the root of disease was a compromised relationship between the person and God. And that is not an unusual perspective. In fact, when we get to the Enlightenment and the beginning of the treatment of mentally ill people and people who are put in mental asylums, that was how the early treatment was working, is not that the person had a mental illness, but they had moral failings. And those moral failings were causing the type of insanity or fits that they were going through. I think today, that idea is completely ridiculous and really frightening to think that that's how we were dealing with really vulnerable people. But certainly there is a history of that for sure. So Christian views of disease differed from those held by pagans because of a fundamental difference in belief. Christians' belief in a personal relationship with God greatly influenced their views on medicine. Okay, now kind of going forward to where we really get into the development of what a witch is. The Malleus Maleficarum is I almost said the Bible. It is the book in terms of understanding how our conception of witches are formed. From a German Catholic named Heinrich Kramer. He probably, through his book, is the reason that the witch mania ends up being what it is. So the book translates into The Hammer of the Witches and was essentially a guide to identify, hunt, and interrogate witches. So the book is labeling witchcraft as heresy and quickly became the authority for Protestants and Catholics trying to flush witches out of living amongst them. And for more than 100 years, the book sold more copies than any other book other than the Bible in Europe. So between 1500 and 1660, up to 80,000 suspected witches were put to death in Europe. About 80% of them were women thought to be in cahoots with the devil and filled with lust. Germany had the highest witchcraft execution rate, with Ireland having the lowest. And certainly it makes sense because a German writer is writing this book. So this book, you can look at the PDF of it. It is pretty interesting what it asserts. So it says that there are three elements necessary for witchcraft: the evil intentions of the witch, the help of the devil, and the permission of God. The first section is aimed at the clergy and tries to refute critics who deny the reality of witchcraft, which would thereby hinder its prosecution. The second section of the book describes actual forms of witchcraft and its remedies, and the third section is to assist judges confronting and combating witchcraft, and to aid the inquisitors by removing the burden from them. So a little bit more on the three sections. Section 1 is examining witchcraft theoretically from the point of view of natural philosophy and theology. Remember, we were looking at natural philosophy coming from the Greeks. That's where we were getting atomic theory, we were getting Pythagoras' mathematical theories and the theories on balance, and then also the nature of, well, what is the universe? Is the universe stable or is it chaotic? Also, Section 1 addresses the question whether witchcraft is a real phenomenon or imaginary, or the deluding phantasms of the devil, or simply the fantasies of overwrought human minds. And of course, it's making the case, and let's be realistic about it, also selling books on the idea that there's a profit being made in convincing people that there's witches here. I think that's something that can't be overlooked in terms of trying to understand the phenomenon. Section 2, matters of practice and actual cases are discussed, the powers of witches and their recruitment strategies. And it states that mostly witches, as opposed to the devil, who do the recruiting by making something go wrong in the life of a respectable matron, that make her consult the knowledge of a witch, or by introducing young maidens to tempting young devils. It details how witches cast spells and remedies, and that can be taken to prevent witchcraft or to help those who have been affected by it. So it tells you who they are, it tells you how they go about doing their mischief, and also what can you do to protect yourself. The legal part of the hammer of the witches in Section 3, how do you prosecute a witch? And arguments are laid out for magistrates who are prosecuting witches, and the section often offers a step-by-step guide to the conduct of a witch trial, and which the method of initiating the process and assembling accusations, interrogation, which include torture of witnesses, and also the witch itself, and then the formal charging of the accused. Women who did not cry at their trial were automatically believed to be witches. Again, I think clearly there's an unabashed sexism happening here. Again, from this book written by a man accusing women of not being woman enough, of not having enough emotions. And again, that's pretty disturbing, I think, from today's point of view. Familiars in witchcraft. And we have a picture there from Harry Potter of Scabbers, Ron's rat. In European folklore, medieval and early modern periods, familiars, sometimes referred to as familiar spirits, are believed to be supernatural entities that would assist witches and cunning folk in their practice of magic. According to the records of the times, those alleging to have contact with familiar spirits reported they could manifest as numerous forms, usually as an animal, sometimes as a human or humanoid form, but they were described as clearly defined three-dimensional forms, different than the smoky, undefined forms that you might find in ghosts. When they served witches, they were often thought to be malevolent, but when working for cunning folk, they were often considered benevolent, and sometimes this may be ambiguous in terms of what they are. Now, the evil familiars were thought of as demons, where the more kind, helpful ones are described as fairies. The main purpose of the familiars is to serve the witch, providing protection for them as they came into their new powers. Since the 20th century, some magical practitioners, including the adherents of Wicca, include the concept of familiars due to the association with older forms of magic. These contemporary practitioners use pets or wildlife or believe invisible versions of familiars act as magical aids. Familiar spirits are more commonly small animals such as cats, rats, dogs, ferrets, birds, frogs, toads, and hares, rabbits. And were also cases of wasps and butterflies, as well as pigs and sheep and horses. Familiar spirits were usually kept in pots or baskets, lined with sheep's wools, and fed a variety of things, including milk, bread, meat, and blood. Familiar spirits usually had names and were often given down-to-earth and frequently affectionate nicknames, like Ron's rat Scabbers. Salem witch trials. So as the witch hysteria decreased in Europe, it was growing here in America, which was reeling from wars between the French and the British, smallpox epidemic, and the ongoing fear of attacks from neighboring Native American tribes. The tense atmosphere was ripe for scapegoats. And the best of these is probably the best known of these is the witch trials taking place in Salem, Massachusetts in 1692. The witch trials begin when a 9-year-old named Elizabeth Parris and 11-year-old Abigail Williams begin suffering from fits, body contortions, and uncontrolled screaming. Today it's believed that perhaps they were poisoned by a fungus. As more young women began to exhibit symptoms, mass hysteria ensued, and 3 women were accused of witchcraft: Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, and Tituba, an enslaved woman who is owned by Parris's father. And again, how easy and would it be to accuse a slave of something since they have no recourse in law? That seems like a pretty soft target. So Tituba confessed to being a witch and began accusing others of using black magic. On June 10th, Bridget Bishop became the first accused witch to be put to death during the Salem witch trials, when she was hanged. Ultimately, 150 people were accused and 18 were put to death. Women weren't the only victims. 6 men were also convicted and executed. So Massachusetts isn't the only one of the 13 colonies to obsess about witches. And at the height of it, we find that, women really are having to watch how they behave in public and what kind of lifestyle that they're living. The Book of Shadows. So modern-day witches of the Western world still struggle to shake those historical stereotypes. Most practice Wicca, an official religion in the United States and Canada. Wiccans avoid evil and the appearance of evil at all costs. The motto that they have is harm no one, harm none. And they strive to live a peaceful, tolerant, balanced life in tune with nature and humanity. Many modern-day witches still perform witchcraft, but there is seldom anything sinister about it. Their spells and incantations are often derived from their Book of Shadows, a 20th century collection of wisdom and witchcraft that can be easily obtained and easily found. It can be compared to the act of prayer like other religions. Modern-day witchcraft potion is more likely to be a herbal remedy for the flu rather than a hex to harm anybody. Today's witchcraft spells are usually used to stop someone from doing evil or harming themselves. Ironically, why it's probable some historical witches use witchcraft for evil purposes, many may have embraced it for healing or protection against the immorality that they were being accused of. But witches, whether actual or accused, still face persecution or death. Several men and women suspected of using witchcraft have been beaten and killed in New Guinea since 2010, including a young mother who was burned alive. Similar episodes of violence against people accused of being witches have occurred in Africa, South America, and the Middle East, in immigrant communities in Europe and in the United States. Spells and the types of spells, like banishing, sweetening, binding, protection, freezing, good luck. So magic is first and foremost a technology, a primeval tool that humans stumbled across eons ago for accessing an invisible realm that they sensed held the key to their well-being. Magic gave people an avenue to attain what their hearts desired: protection, divination, healing, luck, vengeance, and most of all, a sense of empowerment. It's a measure of comfort in a cold, dark world. In terms of using words, abracadabra is the Swiss Army knife of spells, reached for in cases where the caster offers no particular spell. It's often the first magical word that a magic word that a child learns, and has become ubiquitous in pop culture in depictions of magic. Language has power in the social world. People use words to hurt, to conceal, to soothe, to dominate, to evoke emotions in each other. They use performative language in Old English verse. So magical numbers, multiples of 3, and a characteristic rhythm combining the alliterative structure of Old English verse with counter rhythms that index its special status as magical. There is a lot of repetition when it comes to casting spells. There appear to be 2 distinct phases in spells. The first one concentrating on gathering in power, and the second on releasing that power with a focused intent in a particular direction. An example of this, the 9 herbs charm calls for an assemblage of herbs. When these herbs are all put together, they're crushed and mixed into a salve, and then the charm is sung 3 times over each ingredients and again over the patient and chanted as the salve is applied. If it's properly executed, the 9-herb charm protects the patient from illnesses believed to come from toxins in the air. So where do we find magic in the modern world today outside of the West? And one of the places that is often cited is the Trobriander spells. So incantations combine specialized language, plants, and symbolic objects are hardly unique, as I was saying, in the Western world, or the Anglo-Saxon world, if we're going to use Old English as an example. In New Guinea, the Trobriand island people have long been known for their reliance on magic. They have spells for black magic, for weather, for healing, for agriculture, fishing, dance, beauty, love, sailing in canoes, and anti-witch or shark magic. Magic provides their cosmology. Incantations are understood as magical conversations with only one speaker. The magician speaks, or they say whispers, and the addressee, or the interlocutor, a plant, an animal, a topographic feature, or spirit, acts in a desired way to bring about a desired effect. A number of conditions must be met. The magician must strictly observe cleansing rituals, food taboos. The correct magical formula must be repeated for the prescribed amount of time with no mistake or omissions. And this is very common in all spells, that the magical words have no power unless they are spoken in the exact right order and, again, the exact right repetitions. For weather magic to bring sunshine, one native magician named Keiosi explains he must first slice a ginger root and place the slices in a paper basket with a tiny slit. While he removes a bit of ginger with his fingers, he recites a 144-line magical formula. He chews the ginger, spits it out, and recites the formula again. This may be repeated as many times as he pleases. Now, this spell, he doesn't know exactly what its name means or where it comes from, and often magic words have no meaning in the mundane world, and this is really a common feature in magical language, again, like abracadabra. I wanted to make a point that what we're studying in terms of magic and whether they come from Western or non-Western places are very similar to shamanism. And a shaman is someone who travels in the world of spirits. We find shamans in Native American culture. We find shaman in early Paleolithic culture. And we also find shaman in nomadic tribes like the San Bushmen. So the San, they are still practicing shamanism as their kind of form of magic and medicine, and they are able to summon spirits. They generally have rituals that are all-night events in which healers go into a trance in order to cure sickness. I would like to show you what one of these performances look like. So here is a San Bushman, and they're doing their healing dance. Now, I want you to think about this, how this might be the same exact ritual that existed tens of thousands of years ago. He's going to talk about at night, when we stay up and we dance, we change. And as someone who used to go dancing in clubs, I absolutely understand what he means. When I would go to clubs and dance at night, I somehow would get out all my frustrations and be ready for work Monday morning. It was a very important ritual to me when I was young, although I didn't think of it as magic, but in a way it was. He's going to dance around the fire. Think about the magic of the fire at night, keeping predators away. Him and the people he's healing are around the fire. He is dancing, and he has gourds around his legs that are making sounds. The people are chanting, and they are beating on percussion instruments. And again, without the light of day, there's a type of magic here. So in this magic, we're looking at the beginnings of music, we're looking at the beginnings of medicine, we're looking at the beginnings of transcendental religion. Let's watch a few moments of this. So notice how he is using the night and dance and sound to bring spirits into himself. That is done in a prescribed way. He's bringing the magic into himself, and when he has that magic, he is able to release it in people as he's massaging them. And again, chiropractic work and therapeutic massage work also release tension in the body, release energy that in Chinese medicine is called qi. Qi is a type of electricity in the body that sometimes gets bunched up, and you'll get pain in your joints or you'll get pain in an area of your body. And then someone who's well practiced in the acupunctural arts can release that qi, that energy, and all of a sudden, that pain is gone. And I routinely go through this. Again, do I totally understand it? Nope. But it works. And so I'm just like, hey, there's things in the world that I don't totally get, but it makes sense in terms of what they're telling me, and then the healing process that is happening as well. Wicca. So Wicca is probably something, and Wiccan is something that you may hear a lot. There are a number of contemporary witches around us who are practicing Wicca, which again is a type of witchcraft that is really using natural properties, and again, maybe something closer to shamanism than, let's say, the Salem witch trials were. So scholars in this modern pagan religion categorize it as both a new religious moment and also part of the occultist stream of Western esotericism, a Western form of spirituality that stresses the importance of the individual to gain spiritual knowledge when confronted with the divine aspect of existence. Wicca is developed in England in the first half of the 20th century, is introduced to the public in 1954 by Gerald Gardner, a retired British civil servant. Wicca has no pope, no central authority figure. Its traditional core beliefs and principles were originally outlined in the 40s and 50s by Gardner and her early high priestess, Doreen Valentine. The early practices were disseminated through publishing books and in secret written and oral teachings passed along to initiates. There are many variations on the core structure, and the religion continues to grow and evolve today. We're looking at a duotheistic type of religion, worshiping and or working with a goddess and a god. So this idea that there's a male and a female that's necessary for this magic to work, think about that going back to the Greeks and the gods of Olympia, where there were 6 male, 6 female gods, right? The idea of procreation that is seemingly connoted inside of the way that the religion is put together. And then, of course, there is the triple goddess and the horn god, respectively. These are traditionally viewed, the male and the female god, as the triple goddess and the horn god. So the idea of the male having horns, which we see in terms of witchcraft and goats, but also horns being a symbol for male animals that then human beings also have adorned in terms of, again, a part animal, part human, maybe shamanistic type of religion. So the 3 main figures are described as the triple goddess as the maiden, the mother, and the crone. Really kind of the 3 ages of a woman. So you have the maiden, the virgin, then the mother, and then the woman who has aged beyond procreation, and the type of wisdom inscribed in living that long and going through motherhood. Each one of these stages symbolizes the different parts of female life and a phase of the moon, which often rules one of the realms of the heavens, the earth, and the underworld. Notice the 3 inscribed there also. In various forms of Wicca, the masculine consort is the horn god. These 2 deities are sometimes viewed as facets of a greater pantheistic divinity, which is regarded as an impersonal force or process rather than a personal deity. Okay, so we kind of know a little history of witchcraft, albeit, very short. A little bit about spells, a little bit about shamanism. I want to look at now witches in media, witches in art, witches in film, witches in literature, and to see how these depictions have made concrete our beliefs or our sensibilities of what witches are. We find witches in Francisco Goya's black paintings. Um, Goya was a great Spanish artist who went deaf at the end of his life, maybe had some mental illness that did run in his family. He had seen a lot of death in Civil War, and also with the French invading Spain as well. And at the end of his life, he has this large chateau. He's deaf, and he begins painting on his walls. Not painting for anyone to ever see these paintings. Perhaps the most famous painting is titled Saturn Devouring His Son, where we're seeing this large figure with crazed eyes eating the smaller figure. And yet at the same time, there's the head of a dog here in the lap, and the dog is not feeling the energy of this insanity. The dog instead appears to be trying to calm his master down. It's a very unusual image. Goya also appeared to be painting covens of witches, and we find again the horned male witch here as well. Very strange practice to be painting these on your walls. We don't know what he was going through. The paintings are not discovered until he died, and I think the real shame of the paintings is that we can't go to the chateau and see them ourselves. They've all been cut out of the walls and now live in museums. And I have a problem with that in the same way that I have a problem with Native American culture being in museums. The Native American art that we find in museums was never intended to be there. And the type of magic that is inscribed in it, I think, is desecrated by being in a museum. And I feel the same way about Goya's black paintings, too. Ben Franklin and his great satire on witches. So, one of the most famous witches in Virginia history is Grace Sherwood, whose neighbors allege she killed their pigs and hexed their cotton. Other accusations followed, and she was brought on trial in 1706. The court decided to use the controversial water test to determine her guilt or innocence. Her arms or legs were bound, and she was thrown into a body of water. It was thought that if she sank, she was innocent, and if she floated, she was guilty. Sherwood didn't sink and was convicted of being a witch. She wasn't killed but put in prison for 8 years. A satirical article, probably written by Benjamin Franklin, about a witch trial in New Jersey was published in 1730 in the Pennsylvania Gazette. It brought to light the ridiculousness of some of these witchcraft accusations. And it wasn't long before the witch mania died down in the New World and laws were passed to help protect people from being wrongly accused and convicted. The satirical article about the witch was untitled, and it was dubbed A Witch Trial at Mount Holly. A brief narrative describes a determined effort of a mob in a small New Jersey town to find a man and a woman guilty of witchcraft after they had been accused of making sheep dance and hogs sing. That is so stupid. I love this. I hope that this is Ben Franklin, and I like the idea that one of the best ways to get people to stop believing in stupid shit is to have a satire, right? Like we learned in our lecture on appropriation art. Right? Let's make fun of the seriousness of what they're doing, and then let's examine it. And let's be honest. If I ever found someone who could make sheep dance or hogs sing, I want to go to that show. Whatever the ticket price is to that show, please invite me to it. I would love to see it. Sociologist Michael Taussig, he describes the nervous system in us, and that in us, we as people, we are very fragile. Get too hot, if we get too cold, our nervous system shuts down. And Michael describes our entire political system as one nervous system, that we are always living in a state of being driven from being scared from one news story to another news story to another news story. And he believes that this nervous system of our body is very similar to this nervous system in the state. And he also says that any state, any political system gains power if they can get you to be in fear all the time. And I think that there is definitely a lot of truth in that. He also says that people living in the periphery of the world of the capitalist economy have a critical vantage point on capitalism. They articulate their critiques of capitalism in terms of their own cultural idioms. He concludes that anthropologists should study people living on the periphery of the world capitalist economy as a way of gaining critical insight into the anthropologist's own culture. The shifts of the anthropologist's object of study of other cultures to that of their own repositions the former objects of anthropological studies, like indigenous people, as valued critical thinkers. So if you want to study capitalism and how it affects us, you should study people who are outside of the system and how they're beginning to view the system. And he cites in Colombia, sugarcane cutters can make a contract with the devil that will cause them to make a good deal of money. But that money can be spent only on frivolous consumer goods, and that the cutter will die an early, miserable death. Taussig argues that through the devil, peasants express their recognition that capitalism is based on the magical belief that capital is productive. For Taussig, the truth is always a mediated truth. My subject is not the truth of being, but the social being of truth, not whether the facts are real, but what the politics of their interpretation and representation are. So notice with the sugarcane cutter's story, so even though you're working at the bottom ladder of capitalism, not making very much money, being kind of taken advantage of, that is still better than making a deal with the devil to have riches. And so notice how it's a story that is kind of codifying and making the acceptance of capitalism not one simply on economics, but also a type of religious belief as well. In terms of shamanism and I guess a type of witchcraft, Taussig also talks about mimesis and alterity. In mimesis and alterity, he looks at the way that different cultures experience or assimilate another's culture or cultural mimesis in terms of how we come to identify or distance ourselves within or from alterity, from a culture. So this notion that we are always absorbing culture is a theme running in our class. We have seen this absorbing of cultures in soap operas and telenovelas. We will look at it in terms of rock and roll. This is definitely something that we find prevalent in culture. So his discussion of this is centered around a German theorist named Walter Benjamin and Theodor Adorno. They are from the Frankfurt School of modern theoretic thought. And They have a biologically determined model in which mimesis is posited as an adaptive behavior prior to language that allows humans to make themselves similar to their surrounding environments through assimilation and play. In other words, you learn language by mimicking words when you're a child, and also you are also learning as a child how to adopt the behavior, how to learn how to eat, how to learn how to stand in line, all of these things to be assimilated ultimately into adult culture. Through physical and bodily acts of mimesis, i.e., the chameleon blending in with its environment, or a child, say, imitating a windmill or whatever, the distinction between the human subject, the human ego, and the body as an object are not firm, but rather malleable. And that idea of the subject, the essence of yourself, the belief in the brain, the power of yourself through your ego, and the relationship of the body. That relationship, which is talked about in Plato and Plato's forms, and the purity of the mind versus the fallibility of the body, also is done with St. Augustine in Catholic theology, where the body is profane, but the soul is pure. Tausig's theory is saying that these things early on in our life, that they are things that are not firm and set in stone and can be worked with, and again, explain the way that different religions work on people, the way that different belief systems work on people. He believes that magic constitutes a prehistorical or anthropological mimetic model. Well, we see that certainly in shamans taking on spirit animals, or Native Americans doing an eagle dance, or Native American shaman putting animal spirits into people to heal them. So the witch doctor's identification with a wild animal results in an immunization, an elimination of danger and the possibility of annihilation. Such a model of mimetic behavior is ambiguous in that imitation might designate the production of a thing-like copy, but on the other hand, it might refer to the activity of a subject which models itself according to a given prototype. So we become something by either distancing ourselves from it, or making ourselves closer to it, or taking in the spirit of it for many, many processes. Witches in film, The Wizard of Oz. So the most famous fictional witches are Glinda, and the Good Witch, and also the Wicked Witch of the West in L. Frank Baum's book, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. Historically, a witch is a woman claiming or popular believed to possess magical powers and practice sorcery. In cultural progression, the term has come to represent somebody who is cunning, wise, and otherworldly, skilled at one's craft. Or on the flip side, somebody spiteful, overbearing, a hag. Until Glinda, we only see witches characterized as old and ugly. We saw that in the Hammer of the Witches also too. But the good witch Glinda, who travels in bubbles through the skies and wears white gowns, she is a new kind of witch, a type of witch that has entered a kind of fame in terms of fashion, and she is a new alternative to what the witch can be. And again, the popularity of this as a film, the popularity of this as a book, is also helping in terms of to create a sense in people that there are alternatives to what a witch can be. In film, in contemporary film, we see witches also in films like The Craft, In the craft, we find witchcraft being used to cast spells that lead to negative consequences. We find power that is achieved from these high school girls. And we also find a hierarchy of power that can ultimately kill, maim, and destroy the rivals that appear between the group in the story. It is a really, I think, interesting version of witchcraft that is, I think, a very entertaining story. But probably the best well-known example of contemporary witchcraft is in Harry Potter, the series of books and movies created by J.K. Rowling. We are looking at young wizards who are going to go to school and to find their power and to fight evil. And throughout the book, we find the evidence of kind of historically what we understand a witch to be. And think about that. Harry Potter exists because we have a mental template already given to us of what witches are. We know that they can be good. We know that they can be bad. They ride brooms. Think of the sport Quidditch that they play. And then also, think about the classes that they have in Harry Potter that include spell casting and stuff like that. Again, where they are using language. And we see that throughout the books. Harry Potter also includes familiars, as I had talked about earlier. And we certainly find analogies in Harry Potter to older forms of writing, like C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia. We get Christian symbolism and allegory. And so it's not just that witchcraft. I would say, really, from what we've looked at today, that witchcraft is not that far away from Christianity or from Judaism. What we find is that it's the existence of the belief in those religions that lead to this opposite or otherness, which is the profane, the do not touch, it's which I think that the belief in witchcraft and the knowledge of witchcraft exists on an oppositional pole to Christianity. Okay, what do we want to do with all of this stuff here? So the first thing, I have a couple of documentaries that I think are much more effective probably than I am in my lecture. I think they do a very good job of kind of reinforcing where I was going and, again, giving you the history. I think in terms of learning a new subject or trying to internalize a new subject, that it's important to take it from a number of levels and a number of perspectives. I think very rarely do we ever really understand a subject from one person, one lecture, one book, one movie, whatever it might be. I think that multiple ways of approach, multiple levels, I think give you a deeper understanding. And so I'd like you to watch The History of Witches Part 1, and then I have questions. What are the differences between the Abrahamic and the Satanic witch, the sword and shield high fantasy witch, the pagan or natural witch, and plain generic witches? So the documentary starts out by describing what these four types of witches are. Are these four categories always easy to find in media, like The Craft or Harry Potter or The Wizard of Oz? And I think I'll let you decide on that from what you get from the documentary. How are witches treated before The Hammer of the Witches was written? How are they treated after? And I think you'll be very surprised, or maybe not surprised, to find out that there is a major difference. That when you create a popular media that is villainizing a person or people you don't understand, that certainly leads into people being treated much differently. So we can see also from the Hammer of the Witches how powerful written words in literature can be. Why do you think that words written, even though they may be one person's fantasy, can become reality? And that's a very fascinating idea, not just in witchcraft. How often do we find that words create reality? Somebody says something, it's said over and over again, and the next thing we know, it is a belief that is very much a Barth belief, and that's the way it is. It is the way it is, right? Language does that to us. And I am someone who believes that language creates reality, that when you begin to put things in the air, people begin to believe it as fact. I think you and I both know that the internet does that all the time. The fourth question, how do we find the Hammer of the Witches to be inherently sexist in its intent? I think that's pretty easy to figure out. And then how is the book mentioned in the video a way to control women by getting women to be afraid to talk to each other? I think that's a very powerful thing that you're going to see in this documentary too. So really what's happening in the witch trials and in the Hammer of the Witches and the executions is that women are being afraid to speak to other women. And when you have women afraid to talk with each other about the circumstances of their lives, they are more easily controlled by men. That's an idea in the second wave of feminism that was going on when women were having consciousness-raising ceremonies, where they were housewives who were isolated from each other and maybe felt that they were just griping or complaining, and then they meet with other women who are going through the same thing, and they begin to realize, hey, maybe there's something to the way that we feel that we're not being treated fairly. Something I want you to think about in the documentary. Then I would like you to watch the first 22 minutes of Witches in Literature and Art from the History of Witches Part 2. And I want you to look at Goya's black paintings that I teased out for you. How does Goya seem to feel about people who believe in the stereotype of witches in his era? And then also, how does The Wizard of Oz by Frank Baum destigmatize witches in literature? And then I have an extra credit, a couple of points. How does J.K. Rowling destigmatize witches in her Harry Potter series of books? Or if you've seen the films. I have not read the books, but last semester I watched all 8 films and took notes, and I binged them. I watched the entire series twice in a weekend to then talk about it in our class on witchcraft. So I hope you have some interesting ideas and that you have a kind of open mind as you're doing the assignment, and I look forward to seeing what you have to write. I'll talk to you soon, and we will go into cults.